Hey guys, we're filming this today, April 27th, and I'm in Long Beach, California. And as many of you might know, I have a shop in Brooklyn, New York, as well as Long Beach. And both New York and California have been hit pretty hard from coronavirus, and probably more so in New York. It's pretty significant. Big thing that's been coming up a lot lately is more and more people are getting out biking, but I've often wondered to myself, what is a safe way to do it? How should we operate? What are some considerations we should be thinking about? And I kind of figure to have a video to spark a sort of discussion on that. I'm not claiming to be a medical expert or have really the end-all be-all information on this topic, but I did a decent bit of research. I've talked with a significant amount of people on this topic, and I've also just observed what's going on in New York, what's going on in California and other places throughout the country. And I think that there's a lot of things to consider. One thing from my side, I'd love to see that more people are out on bikes, but really we need to consider how should we be doing that? Is it safe to do that? And there seems to be, most of the professionals would agree that it largely is safe to ride a bike. It's one of those activities you can do while still social distancing. Certainly certain ways of riding a bike, say for example riding in a group, specifically you're riding a group that you're not cohabitating with, could be of concern. And we're seeing most of these group rides or races or any sort of activities that involve a group of people riding, even potentially two people, because it's likely that you're coming in close contact with somebody that you are biking with. So I know that we might be inclined to want to just go out for a ride with friends and stuff like that, but it's definitely something we have to be mindful of and be careful of, because that could be a way that we're going to transmit this from one person to another. Certain other details, people talk about this 6-foot distance. I'm not really sure that that 6-foot thing, really applies in the same way that it would in cycling or running or other sort of activities, because if you think about it, if you're riding at a high rate of speed, whatever, if you cough or you sneeze, that matter might travel a bit further. So it's something to be mindful that you want to generally have more space between you and others. Really, I should say that most of these things, it might seem like common sense, based on what we do know at this point. I think there's still so much more that we don't know, so we have to just exercise caution that we don't know really all the details on this, and there's still more to be revealed of how this can be transmitted, how we can be impacted, how we might impact others. So it's definitely something to consider. But as I said, traveling at a high rate of speed, you might potentially transmit things. One of the suggestions was not riding in particularly crowded spaces. Now, this is very challenging in certain places, like New York, for example. It's pretty much always crowded. Certainly a lot less crowded than it has been, but you could still find that many of the bike paths can be crowded. So if you're riding just for recreation, you're not an essential worker that's using a bike for transportation, you might want to consider being mindful and respectful of the other people that have to get out and use the path, and try and ride in those less busy times, maybe very early in the morning or later in the day, or maybe the middle of the day. It really depends on where you are. Or try to use some of the paths that are not heavily trafficked by other cyclists or even other pedestrians for that matter, because anyone that we come in contact with, there's that potential for transmission. And there's really so much to consider in reference to this. And I hope that you guys will maybe participate in comments and say what your experience has been, what's working for you, what's not working, what seems to make sense or doesn't make sense, maybe any relevant articles. I read a bunch of articles, read the guidelines on the CDC website, and some other bike organizations have looked a little bit more deeply into this as well. So, it's difficult sometimes to figure out what information really to trust, and I think that really would be my recommendation, to just use caution. There might be many people just saying like, oh yeah, biking's great, get out there and do it, but I think that there's a responsible way to do it, and maybe not all biking activities are responsible at this point. Some other details that came up, some people would say, well, you should just use a trainer and bike in your house, and certainly that's one way of doing it. But there's certain benefits to being outside and being exposed to the sun, and the idea of just staying in your house 24/7 and never spending any time outside, I don't know if that's actually the healthiest idea either. Biking is also considered, exercise, and it's certainly understood that having an improved cardiovascular system and your respiratory system and overall immune system being more healthy is going to be beneficial in the transmission of any virus, or more so fighting that virus for that matter. One thing to note though, any real extreme activities could actually temporarily lower your immune system. So that's something to be mindful of. Like if you had that really extreme workout and you feel just totally spent after that, at that point your immune system is actually diminished as well until you actually recover from that. So it might be a time that you kind of wait to participate in those sort of activities until maybe we're at a little bit of a safer space. Another really hot topic, or something that comes up a lot in discussion about COVID-19 and how we can be outside and that sort of thing, is face masks. And naturally, I don't know how much experience you have using a face mask, but as I've been using it more recently here in California, it's required when we're outside to be using a face mask. Certainly when we go inside stores, very important. But it can be kind of challenging to breathe with that mask on, and there's different types of face coverings. You go from the N95 mask, which is a medical mask, which is a bit controversial at this moment, of whether just like the average everyday person should be using that, or since there's some concerns about supply, maybe we should be using more of these like homemade masks. Or one thing that's been brought up a lot is the buff. It's a covering that it's kind of like a neck garter that covers your face, and there's different forms of them, different materials. Certainly biking in different weather can be challenging, so this is one topic that was brought up from a friend of mine actually in Arizona. He's biking often in very hot temperatures, so the idea of wearing a face mask while biking in a hot temperature can be challenging. He found that the buff works pretty well. Well, I thought about maybe if I wet the buff, that could be beneficial because it will keep me cool while still protecting me. But one thing I found in some of the research that I did, that actually having that material wet, it doesn't perform as well. So that's certainly a consideration. You might want to find some different ways of staying cool while still, protecting yourself and others. I think that a buff is certainly one way to go. I think, when you think about it, if you're out somewhere and you're kind of in the middle of nowhere and there's nobody around, do you need to have a mask on? I think that that's something, you're going to have to decide and be responsible about. So the mask thing, there's so many different people talking about this. I'm certainly by no means an expert, but you could think of it, again, as I said, just common sense. One of the methods that some people say, like to test the effectiveness of a mask or a face covering, is if you put the mask over you, do you think you can blow out a candle with it? At that point you can tell how much air is flowing, but certainly that's a concern if you're trying to exert yourself in any sort of extreme way. If you can't breathe effectively, we certainly don't want you to end up in the hospital because you're, restricting your breathing. One other detail that I think is really important is about the type of risks that you might take. Naturally, some people, when they're riding a bike, there's certain behaviors that are exhilarating and fun, and there's a certain dangerous element to it, but this is definitely not the time to be doing any extreme jumps or doing anything crazy or jumping off the curb or coming really close to people or stuff like that. This is a time we have to exercise, extreme caution, because that behavior could potentially injure you, which could end up, causing you to go to the hospital. Maybe it's not because of coronavirus, but you end up in the hospital, and we put more stress on the hospital system at a time that is really already difficult for them. So be mindful of that. It's really just about what this really all boils down to from my perspective. Again, not an expert, but just what I've seen and learned, and I'm certainly interested to hear your feedback. Hopefully it doesn't get into too much of a political thing, because I know that can go there, and I just don't want to go there. It's just about being responsible, being mindful and respectful of others. It's just being safe out there. Just think twice in the activities that you're doing. How are they going to impact others? And really we have to think of others. And yeah, so I hope that this was helpful. I probably plan to put out other videos in the future, maybe about some additional helpful tips. This buff face covering, this was a discussion that maybe we should include some discussions about that covering, or other sort of coverings that could work really well for biking in particular. Somebody made a joke that maybe we should have windshields with bikes, and then we could have windshield wipers on them. I think that's maybe a little going too far, but that could be effective. On a more serious note, just let me know what you guys are thinking. Let me know what you think of this video, if you found it to be helpful. I hope you did, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. All right, well, see you soon.